Welcome to the Sun Protection Summit. I'm here today, really excited to talk to Dr. Jaclyn Chasse, and she is a licensed naturopathic physician, and she also, so she's got dual hats that she wears, which I'm really excited about. She's a clinician. She has a private practice called Perfect Fertility. We'll talk to you a bit more about that in a second here, Jaclyn. And then she's also the vice president of medical education at Elevate at Emerson Ecologics, which means she is knee deep in making sure we get good education and also high quality products that are available for practitioners when they're talking about different supplements and whatnot. So we'll jump into a little bit of that too. But do you mind giving us a little bit introduction about yourself, Jaclyn?
Of course. So I'm a naturopathic physician by training, and I graduated a little over 10 years ago. Started out in a family practice situation and built a large integrative clinic. And now I really focus on the niche of fertility, like you mentioned. So reproductive health, women's health, and infertility are what I do pretty much exclusively. I also work with Emerson. My big projects there are helping Elevate, which is our online dispensary platform, both designing a product that works really well, but then also helping doctors get that in their practices and get them using it successfully as another kind of passive revenue source. And then the other piece of it is the quality and education. So making sure that our distribution centers are in good shape, and then running our EQP program, which is a quality verification program that we do for the brands that we carry, which is about 300 brands. So it's a big job to make sure they're all doing their job to make great products.
Yeah, and I think it'll be really fun to talk about some of the quality approaches that you take and what you think makes a product quality. But before we jump into that, since we're talking about sun protection, why don't we talk a little bit about, and you mentioned earlier to me, some of the personal experiences that you've had with sun exposure and some of the challenges that come up with some of these random things that come up with sun exposure. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with polymorphous light eruption?
I'm happy to. So, I'm a sun baby. We have a lake house that I grew up at as a kid and spent all the time outdoors. And, we're pretty good about sun protection generally. So I was really shocked, like during my second pregnancy, we went on a winter vacation to Florida. I was pregnant, about 7 months pregnant. And after I got home, 4 or 5 days after I got back to Boston, which is where I live, I broke out in this rash in all of the areas that had been seen by the sun. And it was blisters, it was itching, it was just awful. In fact, I was working at Emerson and my boss at the time sent me home and she's like, "You look so uncomfortable, like please just go home," because I was like an eyesore to look at. It was that bad. And it took a long time to figure out what it was. My local providers actually didn't know. And in the end, I did the research and found out about this kind of delayed hypersensitivity. And I saw a specialist dermatologist down in Boston, but there wasn't much at the time that could be used conventionally to treat it other than phototherapy. So I didn't really need to do that. I didn't do that. I just kind of managed it. But since that time, I've done extensive research on it to try to figure out what I can do to protect myself. And now this is about 7 years later. I think that things are pretty well managed. I love being outside. So it's very difficult for me to avoid the sun. But I finally found some strategies through natural medicine that can really help and do help me avoid reactions.
I do want to make a comment on that too, because with polymorphous light eruption, PMLE, one of the challenges is, like you said, it might seem contradictory to say, oh, phototherapy is going to help, but it turns out a little bit of light kind of what we say hardens the skin so that then you can take on that sunlight in the future and not have that same eruption. But can you talk about what were the symptoms that you had? Because maybe one of the things that a lot of people wonder is, how is this different from a sunburn? Because don't you get blisters with a sunburn? So could you talk a little bit more about your symptoms?
Sure. So the biggest symptom that is unavoidable is itching. So, and I actually still do experience that when I go in the sun and I get too much sun, my skin will get itchy before I'll get a rash. When I had the initial, outbreak, I don't know what you would call it, I was covered in fluid-filled pustules, very, very small. So like not a blister like a sunburn blister where it becomes like a more confluent blister, but they were these tiny pruritic fluid-filled, pustules kind of everywhere that the sun touched. Some areas were just red and it did look more inflamed and less like a sunburn, more of an allergic type rash. And that's actually what I thought it was at first, was some kind of skin irritation, maybe to, something I was exposed to at the day spa we went to, or maybe even my sunscreen, because it was on the areas I'd applied sunscreen. But their itching is really the biggest symptom that is very, very different from a sunburn, which obviously you get a little more pain with.
And you said something in there that I think is really important. You mentioned that you got these symptoms in the areas where you applied sunscreen. So that goes to show that while sunscreens are very effective at preventing sunburns, with PMLE, it's a little different. Wouldn't you say that the sunscreens sometimes don't cover the ranges that sometimes trigger this reaction?
That's right. So UVA and UVB rays can both trigger PMLE depending upon the individual. And really what happens is, if people don't really understand the condition, essentially your immune system reacts to your own skin cells that are changed or damaged by the sun. So UVA and UVB can both cause a little bit of damage and cause those cellular changes. And then those abnormal proteins get recognized by the immune system and attacked, just like they would for a topical allergy or even an oral allergy. It's a very similar experience, which is why there's a delay in the reaction. But yeah, I mean, it's, that sun-covered areas, all the places that the sun had touched. And again, that's where you put sunscreen. So it can be difficult to differentiate between the two. And actually, I bet a lot of people think they have allergies to sunscreen when in fact they might have PMLE.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Jaclyn. I think that's a really important point, because it might not be the sunscreen, it might just be that there's a portion of the sun's rays that are just not getting protected by the sun.
Right.
The sunscreen itself. Well, why don't you so how did you go about approaching treatment? Because you did allude to the fact that, initially it's a challenge to think about treatment. So what did you end up doing? What was your approach?
Well, the first thing I did was try to just avoid the sun. And, I'm not someone to lay on the beach, but I garden and I hike and I like to be outdoors. So the first thing I did was buy clothing that offered me protection. So you didn't see me outside without like a giant sun hat and a surf shirt on, covering up my swimsuit, really just trying to make sure that my skin was covered. And that was the first thing I did. And the second was making sure that I had adequate sunscreen and was better about applying it more frequently, to make sure that if it got washed off in the water or I was applying it every couple of hours, to be more consistent with it. That was really the first step that I took. And then diving into PubMed, I came across an ingredient called alpha glucosylrutin, or it's called, AGR. So AGR is an ingredient that at the time, the only product that was available commercially was out of Europe. And so I purchased that and, tried it. And it's basically a lotion that you apply under your sunscreen. And, you might have heard of rutin. Rutin is actually a flavonoid that is utilized for allergy maintenance too when taken orally, like rutin and quercetin, which if you haven't heard of rutin, you've probably heard of quercetin. They're like a brother-sister compound. They exist in orange peels and in citrus fruits, and it's a great flavonoid. And actually, when that's applied, it can help to protect the cells, your skin cells, from the changes that occur in the sun, which makes them not be detected. So that's applied under sunscreen. And I found that to be moderately effective. I don't avoid reactions completely, but it has really decreased the severity of my reactions when I use that. And then from there, I moved on to some oral kind of preventives that I use in the summertime as well. Those don't have such solid research, but they do work really well for me. And I feel like that was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle.
You mean the oral supplementation approach as well?
The oral supplementation, yep. So with oral supplementation, I take rutin orally in the summer. I take 1,000 milligrams twice a day, so it's a pretty high dose. I also do 10 milligrams of astaxanthin daily. And I get a broad-based multivitamin too. So vitamin E is another really important nutrient that you can take orally. And I just get that through my multi. I don't take that separately. But those 3 flavonoids, and then additionally, I try to just include a lot of antioxidants and flavonoids, and I kind of rotate through those. Right now, I'm doing proanthocyanidins, which are another flavonoid group that exists in like red wine and blueberries, all of your red, blue, and purple foods. But those can really help as well with that sun protection. So that's really my regimen that I'm doing orally on top of like a multi and fish oil and probiotic and kind of my standard wellness stuff that I end up adding in the summer to try to help protect my skin.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic because I don't know if people realize that this oral supplementation route is now garnering a lot of research. And it's interesting to hear your perspective just because you have a sensitivity where maybe one of us goes out in the sun, we can hang in there before we get sunburned. For you, there's not that much margin for a reaction, I would say. And do you still have reactions when you're outdoors now from time
I
to
do
time?
get a lot of sun, and funny enough, I don't burn. I've never burned. So the reaction was a really interesting thing to happen to me because I've never struggled with sunburns. I'm like European, my family has Mediterranean skin, and I tan very, very easily. So burning has never been an issue. But it's a very, very different experience. And now I do need to protect my skin from the sun really for that reason.
Jaclyn, what's interesting there that you mentioned is that we see PMLA actually a lot more in people that have a slight bit of pigment in their skin. So it turns out that it's not so common in like what we say Fitzpatrick type 1, but we don't understand why. We see it in folks that are Indian descent, such as myself, Latino descent. For some reason, if there's a little bit of pigment in there, it elevates your risk for PMLE. I have no idea why, but that's interesting that you point out that you've never burned. I hadn't realized that.
Yeah. So, now I just do the best I can to still cover and wear protective clothing. I almost always have a hat on because the biggest area that it's affected for me is like my chest area. So, if I wear a hat, that usually will cover that. And, besides protecting from aging, it'll also help not get this terrible rash. But I do still, if I get a lot of sun, if I'm on vacation in a tropical location, I do, even though I'm doing all these management techniques, I can still feel the itching come on, or I might get a little bit of redness. And that just indicates to me that I need to kind of step back and, just do a better job or take some time out of the sun.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I can only imagine if you weren't doing all these steps, what would happen. It'd probably be a pretty bad breakout. So
yeah,
now,
and I know, if you're listening, you're probably a dermatologist, and, have some empathy for your patients who are going through this, because honestly, like I've gone through natural childbirth, I've had broken bones, and I would say that this is probably one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever gone through. I mean, it was like wearing clothing was impossible. It was just brutal with that first bad rash. So have some empathy.
oh, you mean from the pain, just the discomfort of the clothing touching your skin?
Yeah, the pain and the itching, yeah, just the irritation from that.
Yeah.
Actually, one more thing to mention about that I found intensely relieving with that first outbreak, it was actually a turmeric gel, which isn't on the market anymore. But I wonder if using like a turmeric paste, even made at home, may be helpful for patients. It's very yellow, obviously, but it was intensely relieving. Like corticosteroids didn't do anything. The topical steroids didn't offer me any relief. But this turmeric gel, when I applied it, would take the itch away for a couple of hours. And that was really effective. So I would love to see more research in that area. I mean, obviously, curcumin is a very potent anti-inflammatory, and that's likely where some of that effect was having. But if we could have a natural product that could help with that, that would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, that would be pretty amazing. Totally agreed. So, you mentioned about the empathy and whatnot. So how do you think your experience with PMLE has changed the way you talk about sun protection with your patients?
Well, I think people are becoming much more aware of their need to protect themselves from the sun, which I think is wonderful. Hopefully that conversation is easier for you with patients today too. I think people, the biggest debate that I hear come up is that it's great to naturally produce vitamin D. And so getting a little bit of sun exposure can be great, but not obviously so much that it's causing skin damage. So, it did change the way I talk with patients, because I now understand, kind of what a pain it is to protect my skin from the sun. And I think I took it for granted growing up before I had a PMLE reaction, because I would go out without sunscreen. It was no big deal. And now that I have to do that, it is a hassle of a routine to have to maintain. But it helps me explain, and sometimes I do disclose to patients what I go through for sun protection, but it is really important, and it helps me re-emphasize the importance of that, even though it is an extra step before you leave the house.
Now, when you tell patients about your own experiences, do you think that helps them connect with you better? Because I've also grappled with the same thing, and I tend to tell my patients when I have an experience with something or if something's challenging. I'm wondering, when you talk to them and say that you struggle with this, does that have them lean in a little closer to listen to what you have to say?
I think it does. And in medical school, we always learn to kind of keep your own personal business personal and not share and not disclose. But I think that just the nature of life has changed, where there is a lot more personal disclosure through social media and things like that. And
Yeah, absolutely.
and I do share things with my patients. My social media accounts are public. I have a couple of patients who might connect in with me. So I'm very careful about what information I put out there on a one-to-one reaction as well as in social media. But there have been times, and of course I'm working with couples as they try to build their family, and oftentimes talking with them when they have children. And I think sharing personal experiences when you're doing so to help the patient, it can be a really nice tool to deepen the connection you have with them and deepen the level of trust they have in you because they know you've gone through something similar. But it has to be done in a way that's about them and not about you. And I think that's where I try to keep that line is, are you disclosing because it serves you in some way, or are you disclosing because it serves them? And so I always try to think about that before I do any personal sharing.
Yeah, no, thanks for at least sharing that tidbit about how you take care of patients. And then, so I'm really curious because you've probably tried all kinds of sunscreens, and I do want to shift the conversation towards products and product quality. Now, were there any sunscreens that worked better for you or worse for you? Did you find any ingredients that worked particularly better in your particular case?
Well, actually the kind of like zinc and titanium barrier type of products seem to work really well for me. So the natural sunscreens, especially the ones that leave that gross white residue, those seem to work really well. And I think that's because it is more of a complete blockage.
Yeah.
Those work by a barrier versus by like a chemical reaction. You know so much more about sunscreen than I do. And I'm going to make sure that I learn a lot from this whole entire summit and everyone else speaking. But the barrier type sunscreens do seem to work a little bit better for me. And, I've tried several different brands. The one that I was using was the Badger brand. And I found that to be really helpful, especially that was one of the first kind of natural sunscreens to come on the market and have a better consistency to it. But that's one of the ones I still use.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can always talk about what we know from a knowledge standpoint, but you having experienced this, I think there's something just extra special about you saying, hey, this sunscreen worked or that one didn't, just because you had to struggle through this and you still are dealing with it. Now, speaking about quality, I wanted to get your take on, because there's so many supplements now on the market, and we talked a little bit about oral supplementation. What are some of the things that people should be looking out for when it comes to supplements? How do you define quality when it comes to supplements?
That is such a good question and very relevant, because if you watch the news, I mean, I'm sure you've heard about counterfeit goods and mistaken ingredients and contaminants. And, when we as practitioners are recommending supplements to patients, whether it's for wellness or even more often because they need them because they're not well, we have to be so careful to not introduce anything that could cause harm, and I think that's the first thing that comes to mind for me of like why we need to be so proactive about getting educated about quality with supplements. So there's a couple things that I look at. One is the quality of the formulation, and this comes with more experience, the more you learn. And it's very interesting. I love to go into, vitamin shops and like look at new products. And a lot of times they'll do what I call label dressing, using the like window dressing phrase, label dressing, where you'll see these like huge lists of ingredients, but when you look at the doses that are in there, they're so low. Yes. Sometimes 1 or 2 milligrams.
Exactly the thing.
But there's no way they could have any kind of impact. The dosing is so low. Or they use forms of a nutrient that aren't readily absorbed by the body but are dirt cheap. And that type of knowledge only comes with that clinical experience, right? So that's one thing I look for is the formula built to be clinically effective. And you can see that when you're shopping. After that, you have to kind of dig into the company in order to get a better idea. And that's why with us, we have the Emerson quality program, because we know that phoning up a manufacturer and asking all those questions is time consuming and nearly impossible in your workday. So we've done that for you, and we put these seals on the brands that are doing that like above and beyond job to make sure they're vetting quality. So they're doing things like testing every single lot of product that comes out for contaminants and for potency and for purity, rather than testing like every 5th lot, which is allowed by the FDA within the law, but they're going above and beyond that, or making sure they're testing the stability of the product in a more complete way. They're using the highest quality ingredients, things like that. So we try to do that vetting for people, so it's like a quick and easy way to make sure you're getting something good.
So, and when you say you look at the quality of the company, I think that's a really important point. What is it that you look for in the company that indicates that there's high quality there?
Well, a lot of it you have to kind of get under the hood and ask questions to find out. So, I'm lucky because with my role, I've been able to tour the manufacturing facilities and see the manufacturing records and the SOPs and the policies for most of the brands in our industry. But the best brands, I think the biggest thing they're doing is they're building really good relationships with the companies that supply their ingredients, and they're asking a lot of questions, and then they are really testing the ingredients before they're used. So, there's kind of two aspects of quality. One is the manufacturing facility, but unless you're working with an herbal company, can I use names in this?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is all, yeah, as long as you have multiple names that you mentioned, sure.
Sure. So, if you're working with a company that is like seed to product, like Gaia Herbs is an example where they have a farm, Standard Process has a farm. There's a lot of companies out there that they're growing their own and they have complete control from like the beginning of the ingredient until the bottle. That's rare. That's really rare where they own the whole entire manufacturing process. For most companies, when they manufacture, they're buying ingredients in bulk and then they blend them into a custom formula and then they put them into a capsule and bottle them and sell them. And that's the manufacturer. But in that case, the quality of their product is completely dependent upon the quality of the ingredients that they're buying.
Right.
So in that case, the sourcing of ingredients is important, and particularly for herbal medicines.
Yeah.
So if you're buying vitamins and minerals, a lot of those are commodity items today, and your knowledge of like what form of a nutrient is really important to apply to quality. But if you're looking at, ascorbic acid is pretty much ascorbic acid no matter where you buy it from. But if you're looking at an herb, let's use bilberry as an example. So bilberry, I like it because it's a great flavonoid. It has proanthocyanidins, and it's great for the skin, but also for vision. It's been very well studied for vision. Now, when bilberry started having research published on it, there became this big demand for bilberry because companies wanted to make eye products, and they're all like macular health products. They started buying a lot of bilberry, and the market didn't have enough in there. And all of a sudden, all this bilberry came to market. Well, it turns out when they started testing the product, it was bilberry blended with blueberry. Now, blueberry is not harmful. Blueberry is not, toxic. It's not going to cause harm, but it's not effective, right? And so they were blending it enough that it would pass tests when companies brought the ingredient in-house, but the best companies were picking up that the HPLC scans and all the, scans they were doing for identity, they weren't quite right, and they were sending the ingredient back. But when they send it back, it just gets sold to another brand. So, you get some contamination in the marketplace, and that's where, quality comes into play. I could give you, 10 examples off the top of my head like that one, where there's intentional adulteration of ingredients in order, like what we call it economic adulteration, where an ingredient's potency might be cut, or they might add something that's close enough but not quite the quality ingredient you're looking for. And then sometimes there's accidental adulteration, and there's been examples of this as well, like black cohosh, which is kind of famous for its management of hot flashes and menopause. Right. Well, black cohosh, when they surveyed the market, they realized that a lot of the ingredient was actually the wrong species, and that was completely accidental because it's typically wild crafted, meaning they pick it out of the wild. And there was another species of a plant very similar to black cohosh that looked a lot alike that was being picked and processed, but it didn't have the same constituents and it wasn't active. So that's kind of an accidental adulteration. So herbs you have to be very, very careful of when it comes to quality.
Yeah, so one of the fears as a practitioner when you're talking to patients, and it's always a tension there, is that you want to prescribe something and have them go purchase it and make sure it's high quality. And then the other side of the tension is you want them to be able to afford it. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on, is it go hand in hand that more expensive supplements will have a higher quality, or more expensive herbs will have a higher quality, or does that play a role? Does price play a role in that? Because there's a natural tension there, because you want to be sure your patients get the best product out there.
Yeah, unfortunately, in my experience, you do find that the better quality products cost more money. Sometimes it's things like formulation. So fish oil is a good example here. Fish oil is one product that you can find a range of prices, right? The one that I take, I take one capsule and it ends up costing, let's see, it's like almost $1 a day. But one capsule has 1,000 milligrams of EPA plus DHA in it. That's my favorite. I know it's fresh. You might find some fish oil on the marketplace that's not as fresh, and that can be an issue where it's starting to become rancid. But you can also find things that aren't rancid on the marketplace where they're like, buy one, get one free, 1,000 soft gels for $10. Something crazy pricing. But if you read the label, in order to get that 1,000 milligrams, you might have to take 6 capsules, 6 soft gels. And so the potency is much lower. And so even if there's not a quality difference, sometimes there might be a dose difference that affects like convenience and the ability to stay on a protocol. Like I probably could not take 6 fish oil soft gels per day. So I'll pay more to only have to take one. So in some cases, the quality difference, if a patient's willing to put up with a little bit of inconvenience, they can save some money. But other areas, like with herbal medicines, I think there's a big quality difference, and I think it's worth spending a little extra. But I have the same concern you do. Like when I have a patient with fertility, sometimes I'll have my patients on 10 products. I mean, it can be a robust protocol and it can get expensive. So there will be things where I'll say, for your vitamin D, I don't care what brand you buy. Here's the one that I like. Here's why I like it. But you can probably find that even at CVS and just buy the regular item and you'll be fine if you want to go with a cheaper capsule. But with this product, I think there's value in spending the extra for this brand because, and I'll explain it to them, whether it's quality or whether it's like to replace this formula, you'd have to take 3 different products. I'll explain to them why. And then I usually prioritize them too, to say, if this is too much, let me know, and we'll see what things we could drop.
See, I think that would make a huge difference for you to be able to tell a patient why you select a certain brand or why you're selecting something. So how can people learn about which brands would make sense? What are ways that people can self-learn? Obviously, coming to summits like this one where we can get some initial steps or going to other educational programs. But are there things that practitioners can do on their own or databases that they can look at to start the process and start learning more in depth about these aspects of quality?
There's not a lot of resources that are simplified, which makes it really challenging. So, at Emerson, on our website at emersonecologics.com, if you click on the quality link, it explains our program and what we look for. And that's a good place to go to see what kinds of things matter. And from that, you could then, like if you wanted to bring on a new brand that you might recommend, talk to the people that are in customer service at that company or the sales rep for that company and ask them those kinds of questions. If they don't answer thoroughly or they're not willing to answer or they can't answer, that would be concerning to me. The best companies will, especially with their practitioner customers, be very transparent because they know that you're concerned and that you're not going to like spill any secrets. You just want to make sure you can recommend it to patients. The other places that are good are a couple of like industry associations. There's one called APA, which stands for the American Herbal Products Association. And their website has a lot of resources there. In fact, they publish a lot of standards that are used by manufacturers in the industry. So that's a great source. And most of the education there is free. You can just download PDFs and like read a little bit more about that. And then the third place is the American Botanical Council, specifically for herbs. And their website is herbalgram.org. And it's a nonprofit organization that has members that are companies, but also practitioners. And I think there's a very, very inexpensive fee to become a member, but then you get a publication that talks about like the major quality issues that are coming up. I think it's a quarterly publication. And that's a great way to stay on top of what's happening there and to get a little bit more educated about quality.
I think that's fantastic to have at least a couple resources to start with. And then from a practical standpoint, when people go, including myself or anyone, go and look at supplements in the store, or if they're going to purchase something, I loved your phrasing there, label dressing. I thought that's so true because I do see that a lot. I'm wondering, hey, these are tiny amounts. Are we doing anything here? But are there things that you can look for on a label that might clue you in that it's a higher quality product?
Yeah, so the first is that they're not label dressing. The second for me is that I look for products that don't contain proprietary blends, because a proprietary blend is when you'll see on a label, it'll say like proprietary, I don't know, healthy skin blend. And then it will list like 10 ingredients just in a paragraph format, but it doesn't tell you how much of each ingredient. It only tells you how much of the total of those ingredients. And that's another like absolute no for me. And there are some good companies that do it, but I won't use those products, because for me as a doctor, like, could you imagine prescribing a pharmaceutical medicine to a patient where like you just had a blend of ingredients, you didn't know the dosage of each? I would never feel comfortable with that personally. So, I look for products that are disclosing every ingredient. I also look at excipients, which are listed in your other ingredients, and I want to see as few as possible there. So there's a couple that are, you'll always see like cellulose and water, which make up a capsule, or there might be some lubricants and different fillers in there, but usually they'll use like the amino acid leucine or things that are very clean, where I tend to stay away from companies that are using like magnesium stearate, which is a flow agent. It helps sticky ingredients flow through the machinery better, but for certain ingredients, it can make it a little tougher for the body to absorb. So I want a clean profile in the like other ingredients as well. Just minimum. Those are some of the things I look at.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I was just going to ask you about the excipients. And how about in topical products? So not the oral products, but are there certain testing that that you do for topicals, or how do you approach the quality in topicals?
The Emerson quality program is only dietary supplements. So we're not currently testing any topical.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, so that's only for dietary supplements at this point in time. But again, I look at ingredient profiles there and making sure that they're free of parabens and phthalates and some of those known toxic ingredients. For us with Emerson, our whole catalog is free of that. We won't carry any brands that contain anything that's toxic. And I also use the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep tool to kind of vet the products that I'm buying for personal use too, just to make sure they don't contain ingredients that are carcinogenic or reproductive toxins. I love their website, although when I was pregnant, it was hard to look because, almost everything in the marketplace has something in it that causes harm today.
I know, it's especially if you use the Environmental Working Group, some of those, they're going to hit that 5, 6, 7 tiers.
Right. It's discouraging.
Yeah.
And if you find one that's really clean, it's usually like a terrible product experience,
Because it smells or it has a different gritty feel or whatnot. That's
exactly. Yeah.
That's very true. Well, I wanted to end by asking you about one aspect of testing that I think a lot of us have questions about. When it comes to organic testing or any sort of label that gets put on, is there a verification process that people can do? And more specifically, for organic labeling, are there specific folks that give out that organic certification? And does it differ from company to company? What does it mean to have organic certification?
Yeah, so the organic certification is defined by the USDA. So it is like a governmental certification. And there's really two ways. Well, the only way it can be vetted is through supply chain management. So what that means is that they're tracing ingredients back to their source to make sure that they were raised organically. So the way the law is written in the supplement world, and I think this probably would apply to topicals too because it's more ingredient based, is that if it's grown with organic practices on like a certified organic farm, and then they don't introduce anything into it other than that ingredient through the manufacturing process, it can keep that label as long as it doesn't need to be retested, for example, for pesticides and herbicides. If something wasn't grown organically and they test it at the end to be free of pesticides and herbicides, they can't label it organic. They can just label it free of pesticides and herbicides. So if it contains an organic seal, that's something that means that it came from a certified organic farm. And for the most part, we're seeing that, that only exists on ingredients coming from an organic farm. The other big kind of sister label that you might see is GMO free. And similarly to organic, the non-GMO project, for example, that only gets applied if they can trace the ingredient back and affirm that it's non-GMO. And that's easy for plant products, but when you get into animal-based products, like let's talk about lanolin, for example, that might be in a topical, that gets very difficult because they have to understand like the environment that that sheep was in and whether it ever ate anything that was non-GMO throughout its whole life. So plant products we're getting a grasp on. Animal-based products we're still trying to figure out the best way to manage it.
Yeah, that can be a challenge. Well,
Yeah.
Dr. Jaclyn Chasse, I think this has been extremely educational. I don't think a lot of us get any training in thinking about supplement quality, but we have tons of questions about it. We always ask questions. Well, how do you know about quality? Well, here's the start for everyone listening. This is enlightening. So I think if people want to learn more, we'll put the resources in the handout together and make that available. And appreciate you spending some time with us today, taking us through not only your personal experiences, but how we should be thinking about quality when it comes to products.
Great. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much.